Soundings Audiobooks presents an unabridged recording of Death and the Cornish Fiddler, written by Deryn Lake, read by Michael Tudor Barnes. The moral right of the author has been asserted. Side 1. Chapter 1. Spring had come. The apothecary knew it as soon as he opened his eyes. The light, filtering through the drawn curtains, was different from the light of other mornings, for this was radiant and bright, with a certain strange, disturbing quality. Raising his head from the pillows, he heard the sparkling notes of a thrush giving voice, and was filled with a sense of relief that the long winter had finally ended, and that the land was burgeoning with life once more. Moving quickly, John Rawlings got out of bed, and pulling the curtains back, stared out at the magnificent landscape that lay before him. Far below was the River Exe, winding its way meanderingly through the green fields that banked it on either side. In the distance, to his right, stood the ancient town of Exeter, its steeples reflecting the early morning sun, its cathedral a splendid burst of gold as the rays caught its spires. To his left lay the stable block and the coach house, and peering more closely as he threw the window open, John could see his daughter, Rose, fast approaching her 5th birthday, mounting a small but substantial pony. Beside her, assisting with the lifting on, stood a familiar dark figure, today clad in a midnight blue riding habit. Elizabeth de Lorenzi, widow of an Italian nobleman and daughter of the Earl of Exmoor, was not only up, but about to give Rose a riding lesson. John, watching from his bedroom window, was suddenly taken up with the glory of the morning, and experienced a strange surge of excitement which started deep in his blood. For a minute, he puzzled as to what it was, then realized that it was his response to the changing seasons, that he was suffering from a wonderful, heady attack of spring fever. Closing the window again, he pulled the bell rope, and as soon as the hot water arrived, washed and shaved before putting on his clothes and hurrying downstairs. But he was too late. Elizabeth and Rose had already gone off, and he was left to his own devices. Eating his breakfast solitary, the apothecary's thoughts wandered. This was the 3rd occasion on which he had visited Devon since the death of his wife Emilia. The first had been when he was on the run, accused of Emilia's murder. The second was when the case had been solved and he had taken Rose with him, despite her lack of years. The 3rd time had been now, drawn back by Elizabeth's dark, ugly beauty, which still exerted a fascination for him, to say nothing of his daughter's enthusiasm for the West Country. It had been the Marchesa who had originally suggested John return to Gunnersbury and try to discover the identity of the true murderer, and so he had, eventually unmasking a person dangerously crazed in his view. But now, all that lay in the past. It was April 1767, and here he was, feeling the first stirring of spring, not only in the land, but also within himself. Impatiently, the apothecary laid down his napkin and went outside in the direction of the stables, determined to ride out and find Rose and her intriguing instructress wherever they might be. As he mounted the large, skittish black stallion which Elizabeth had chosen for him when he first arrived, John found that today particularly he could not get the Marchesa out of his thoughts. Even though several years had elapsed since he first set eyes on her, she had still refused to share his bed, telling him that he was merely seeking Emilia, and that she was no substitute for his dead wife. With that, he had been forced to content himself, and in the 16 months since Emilia's death had led a blameless and celibate life. But now, with spring's awakening, not only in the land but within himself, he was going to find this situation difficult to contend with. Digging his heels into Jet, the dark horse's sides, the apothecary set off rather faster than he had anticipated. Though he kept his seat well enough, he was not the world's best horseman, and it had seemed to be his fate that wherever he went he was given some mettlesome mount, either that or one painfully slow. The compromise, the kindly, gentle horse who could go at a pace, constantly eluded him. Reaching the edge of the high plateau on which Abbotswood Place, Elizabeth's fine house, was built, John looked down into the valley below. There, trotting along, were Rose and the woman with whom he was preoccupied. The apothecary waved, but they did not see him. "Rose!" he shouted, for some reason not wanting to call to the Marchesa. She looked up. "Hello, Papa. Come down and be with us." The apothecary motioned his horse downwards, leaning back in the saddle, wishing that he cut a more dashing figure, horribly aware of Elizabeth's amused stare following every move he made. Praying that he wouldn't fall off, he finally reached the bottom and gave Jet a thankful pat on the neck. Rose came forward to meet him, and John looked at her fine colour enhanced by the tumbling red of her hair. "Hello, gypsy girl," he said. She smiled at him. "Why do you call me that?" He put out his hand and ruffled her curls. "Because of your hair." "Don't you like it?" "You know I love it. What do you think, madam?" Elizabeth had come to join them, sitting easily on her mount, which today she rode side-saddle. She looked at Rose critically, treating her, as always, as a small adult. "I would say that it is your finest feature, and when you grow up, I believe it will break hearts." "What do you mean?" asked Rose, fractionally anxious. "I do not speak literally. I mean that when you are 17, there will be a queue of admirers which your father will have to send away." "What? Every one of them?" John's daughter burst out, and the two adults could not help but laugh at her earnestness. "I promise I'll let the best of them stay," the apothecary answered. He changed the subject. "Where are you two off to?" He addressed Elizabeth. "I thought we might ride over in the direction of Wildtor." "Won't it be a bit rough for the pony?" He actually meant for Rose, but was too kind to say so in front of her. Fortunately, the Marchesa understood, as she understood much about the Rawlings family. "I didn't mean to the Grange itself. I shall turn back as soon as the going gets heavy." "Good. Then I'll come with you. You know I'm not much of a rider." "I think you are improving greatly." "Another few months here, and you would be as good as anyone in the county." "Ah, yes. I need to talk to you about that," John answered in an undertone. The Marchesa shot him a look from her brilliant dark eyes. "This afternoon, perhaps, while Rose is resting." "Very good, madam." He trotted forward, catching up with his daughter, who had pulled slightly ahead of them. Everywhere he looked, there were signs of the newly arrived season. The banks of the river glowed green as mint, and randomly growing in the valley were clumps of wild daffodils, while primroses cascaded in abundance down the sides of the craggy pathway. Above him, grazing on the steep escarpment, were mild-mannered sheep, lambs suckling beneath them, or running or leaping, and generally behaving as all young, carefree creatures do. John thought of Rose, and how happy she was in this habitat, letting the loss of her mother slip from her mind, enjoying the freedom of her life, the riding and walking and playing. He felt he could hardly bear to take her back to London, though he knew that that time was drawing near, for soon he would tire of being idle and want to pick up the threads of his life once more. Again he caught up with Rose. "My darling, do you miss London at all?" "I miss Grandpapa, of course, but I don't miss Nassau Street." "We shall have to return soon, I fear." "Must we really?" "Yes, my sweetheart. I'm afraid we must. Papa must see to his shop." "But, Pa, could you not open a shop down here?" "One day, perhaps." "Oh, please." But the Marchesa, who had been busy inspecting the swans on the Exe, had come to join them, and the apothecary, knowing that Rose would understand, had motioned the child to be silent. Elizabeth looked at the two of them. "Are you ready?" she asked. John could not resist it. "For what?" he answered. The sensational glance swept him. "That depends." He caught her eye. "On what?" "Who knows?" came the reply, as she wheeled her mount and went off at a thundering pace across the valley. John rode along beside Rose, thinking what a beautiful daughter he had, of how Emilia had been in the early stages of pregnancy when she had been killed, robbing him of both his wife and his second child. He had a sudden longing to see her grave again, to kneel beside it and talk to her. He knew then that only a change in Elizabeth's feeling toward him could make him stay in Devon much longer. He turned to Rose. "You love being in the country, don't you, my darling?" "Yes, Papa. But I like it where Grandpapa lives, too." "Do you want to go and stay with him for a while when we get back?" His daughter looked at him solemnly. "Best I'd like it if we came to live in Devon." "I don't think that is going to be possible." "Then Grandpapa's would be nice." How easily pleased she was, and how amenable. Characteristics inherited from her mother, no doubt. He looked at Rose, and she at him, and suddenly he saw Emilia peeping out at him, and was glad and sorry simultaneously. Glad that in a way his wife was still alive, that she had passed on her looks and her character to her daughter. Sorry that he was going to be constantly reminded of how much he had loved her. He slowed his horse. "Shall we go back now?" "Let's have a race first." "Very well." He held his wayward mount back so that Rose won easily, laughing and tossing her hair about and smiling at him. "That was lovely, Papa." "Come along, sweetheart. It's time to go." "What about Mrs. Elizabeth? Should we wait for her?" John gave a wry smile. "I don't think so. She'll probably be some hours yet." They made their way upwards through the height of the morning, past trees burgeoning with heavy buds and bluebells not yet out but already showing their colour. Once more John felt uplifted by the essence of spring, and breathing in the scented air relished every second. It would indeed be difficult to return to London, but he knew that it was an inevitability that he had to face. Later that evening, after he had seen Rose safely tucked into bed, he broached the subject with Elizabeth. As with all spring nights, it had grown a little cold, and she had ordered a fire lit in the parlour where they sat after dinner, both reading. He looked at her covertly, thinking how comfortable he was with her, how at ease, and knew that he was falling in love all over again, which, given the loneliness he had felt since the death of his wife, was understandable. He fell to thinking where it was all going to lead, trying to imagine her living in London, and not really succeeding. She looked up suddenly. "What did you say?" "Nothing. I didn't speak." "Yes, you did. You muttered something under your breath." "I'm sorry. I didn't realize." "John, what is it that's bothering you?" she asked, in that frank way of hers. He decided to be honest. "Elizabeth, I feel that I ought to get back to London. I've been away long enough. I've a life to lead there. Do you understand?" "Of course I do," she answered. "A man of your character could only stay inactive for so long. When do you plan to go?" "In about 2 weeks." "Not before?" "No. As you know, it's Rose's birthday on the 28th of April, and I'm certain that she would enjoy spending it here." "And so she shall. I shall give a party for her, and invite some other children. And, John—" "Yes?" "I've a mind to go to Cornwall shortly, and I would consider it an honour if you would come with me." "How could I refuse an invitation put like that?" Elizabeth's scarred face smiled, making her suddenly beautiful. "Very easily, I imagine. But I have a motive in going." "Which is?" "I want to visit Helstone and see some ancient dances they perform there." "Dances?" asked John curiously. "Yes. They're both as old as time. In fact, one is certainly pagan. That one is called the Furry, and the other Hallan Toe." "How do you spell that?" Elizabeth did so, pronouncing toe to rhyme with no. John listened carefully, Probably originally heel and toe, don't you think? You're likely right. But it is the primitiveness of the occasion that appeals to me. The dance has its roots in pre-Christianity. Though the Church wisely embraced it, it was originally to welcome spring. Don't you find that exciting, John? Not as exciting as I find you, the apothecary thought, though he nodded and smiled enthusiastically. The furry celebrates an expression of joy at the triumph of life over death. It is one of the oldest customs preserved in the country, and I've always promised myself that I would go and see it on some occasion. And to watch it with you can only enhance the pleasure. What a way she had with her, John considered, taking in her coil of dark hair and the glance of her eyes. But he kept his voice quite even as he answered, "Then I will accompany you gladly, madam. I'm sure that London could wait another 3 weeks or so." She smiled. Good. The dance is always held on the 8th of May, so we leave on the 3rd, if that is convenient. And what about Rose? Should we take her? Of course. It may be the only chance she ever gets to see the furry. Who knows? John answered, and spread his hands. Chapter 2. The Marchesa's coach was drawn up outside the front door, and several servants were hurrying backwards and forwards, loading the top with luggage. John, who normally would have lent them an unconventional helping hand, was on this occasion fussing over his daughter, who was standing, large-eyed, wrapped in a travelling cloak, a hat on her head, a favourite toy clutched in her hand. "Are we going to Helstone, Papa?" she asked for the 20th time. "Yes, darling. We're going to see the Furry Dance." "Does everyone dress in furs?" She giggled, laughing a child's noisy laugh at her own joke. John smiled obediently. It's also known as the Floral Dance, but furry is its proper name. He turned, as at that moment Elizabeth swept out, looking dramatic in an enormous feathered hat, the rest of her ensemble a mysterious shade of green, very elaborately finished. John felt that she was dressing in accordance with the seasons, preparing herself, no doubt, for the primitive pleasures of the dances they were going to see. She smiled at the apothecary and his child. "We leave in 10 minutes, so make your final preparations." How long is the journey going to take us?" he asked. "About 8 hours, if we stop for dinner. The coachman says there's a reasonable track as far as Falmouth, but it still means crossing Bodmin Moor." "What about Dartmoor?" "He says the road, or what laughingly passes for one, circumnavigates that." "And what do we do after Falmouth?" "Pick our way across country." John pulled a face. "I hope Rose is going to be all right." Elizabeth gave him a rather disapproving stare. "My dear friend, you are not attempting to mollycoddle the child, are you?" "No, of course not." "Then consider that she will have your pistol and mine to protect her, to say nothing of the coachman and Rufus, the guard. She will be utterly safe, I assure you. And as I remember, you are rather a deadly shot, madam." Elizabeth raised a dark eyebrow. "You recall that, do you?" "I recall every detail," he answered solemnly. Just for a moment, the Marchesa looked disconcerted, and John knew that she was remembering, amongst other things, the one occasion when they had so nearly made love. Then she blanked her features, even though just for a second she had smiled a secret smile. "Most retentive of you, sir." "I'm famous for my sharp memory, madam." "How fortunate," she said, and went back into the house. Rose, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, looked at her father. "Is Mrs. Elizabeth cross, Papa?" "No, my darling," John answered, and he too smiled. He turned to his daughter. "Would you like to use the water closet before we go?" "Yes, please." "Right." And he led her away to the somewhat smelly cubicle into which she insisted on going alone. A few minutes later she emerged, and she and John boarded the coach, sitting expectantly side by side, awaiting the arrival of the woman known to Rose as Mrs. Elizabeth. With a servant accompanying her, the Marchesa appeared, and kissing her hand to the retainers who had gathered to bid her farewell, she too got on board. "You're not taking a lady's maid?" asked John, surprised. "No, I shall have to care for myself," she answered. The coachman gave a crack of his whip and started the team, and they went down the drive at a good pace, then turned towards Oakhampton and the mysterious county of Cornwall that lay beyond. Elizabeth had changed drivers since John had last travelled with her to Gunnersbury, a new man being young and extremely handsome. "What's his name?" he asked, indicating the fellow with a pointing finger. "Jed Ryle." "Why?" "I was just wondering what happened to your other chap. He took a post with Lady Cadogan, who called on me one day and coveted him. I believe he was required for both driving duties and other things." John looked at her quizzically, saying, "Ah." Elizabeth burst out laughing. "Lady Cadogan is a widow and on her own. Does that answer your question?" "Perfectly. If I were you, I'd keep young Ryle under lock and key, though." "Oh, I will. Don't you worry," Elizabeth said airily. They stopped at Oakhampton for refreshment and comfort, then made their way to Launceston, where they crossed the border into the brooding county of Cornwall. Now the terrain grew rough and wild. "Is this Bodmin Moor?" John asked the Marchesa. "Indeed it is, and a bleak and lonely place. They say a wild beast wanders about, slaying cattle and sheep. That's why I brought an extra shotgun." And she indicated the tough-looking individual whom John had noticed clambering up to the seat beside Jed. "Are there any inns?" "One or two." "Do you want to stop?" "Yes, for a short while. I could do with a drink." Elizabeth put her head out of the window. "Jed, can you draw up at the next inn?" "That would be Jamaica Inn, ma'am. I wouldn't recommend it," John heard him shout back. "Why not?" "It's a haunt of smugglers, ma'am." "Then I insist on seeing it. John, are you game?" "What about Rose? Will she be safe there?" "We can leave her in the coach under the protection of Jed and Rufus." "Rose, would you mind that?" John asked. But the child made no answer, and looking closely, the apothecary could see that she had fallen fast asleep. A few minutes later, the coach rattled over the cobbles outside a wayside hostelry. Looking round, John saw a 2-story slate-tiled building with another construction at right angles to the main part. It had a sinister, sombre air, as if it could well hold the secret to dark deeds. The apothecary hesitated, but Elizabeth was already at the carriage door. "Well, are we going in?" He was about to ask if she thought it safe, but could vividly imagine her snort of derision. Instead, he opened the door, and getting out, handed the Marchesa down. They entered a long, low room, a fire burning in an ingle-nook to their right. Round this were huddled various figures, all appearing to be in a somnolent state. Yet, despite this, John noticed that eyes appeared to open momentarily, and a cough rang out, as did a prolonged fart. Automatically, he took Elizabeth's arm and tucked it through his. "Can I help you?" growled a rough voice from a dark recess on the left. Peering, John perceived a wisp of a fellow standing behind a bar, looking as out of place as it was possible to be. In fact, so slight was the man that it seemed as if even Elizabeth could have thrown him with ease. Nevertheless, he was the owner of the voice from hell. Somewhat startled, John replied, "A glass of Bordeaux and a glass of—" He turned to Elizabeth. "Claret, if you please." Claret. He was half expecting the wisp to say that they didn't have such things in stock, but the gravel voice answered, "Take a seat, and I'll bring you your order." Elizabeth and John sat in a dark corner, and exchanging glances absorbed the extraordinary atmosphere. And then, most unexpectedly, One of the figures snoozing by the fire stood up and, producing a fiddle, started to play. Instantly everything changed. His fellow sleepers shook themselves awake, and from hidden recesses more instruments appeared. Suddenly the air was full of sound as the fiddle joined with a flute, a drum, and a tambourine. "Dance, madam and sir," suggested the gruff-voiced barman as he brought their drinks. And the next second, Elizabeth was on her feet and cavorting wildly. John, unable to resist the music's insistent beat, got up and, seizing her round the waist, began to improvise great leaps and bounds. Jamaica Inn was transformed by the sound of that curious band of musicians who had so suddenly started to play. It was as if they possessed some kind of magic, so irresistible were the tunes they produced. Eventually, both Elizabeth and John ran out of breath and collapsed into their chairs, laughing, drinking their wine, flushed, and feeling strangely happy. Then a curious thing happened. The fiddle player came tap, tap, tapping in their direction, and John realized that the man was blind. Of medium height and build, his long dark hair tied back with a bit of greasy ribbon, his clothes, which had clearly once been of quality stuff, now stained and disreputable. He wore a pair of spectacles, the lenses painted black. "Penny for the band, sir," he said. It was an unusual voice, heavily Cornish in its intonation. John reached into his pocket and produced a shilling. "Thank you," he said, giving the fellow the coin. The man felt it, realized its worth, and gave a bow in John's general direction. "Very kind of you, sir. I do thank ye." He tapped his way back to his companions, and they struck up once more. Elizabeth looked at John. "I wonder where they're heading. Do you think it could be to Helstone?" "I don't know. I hadn't really thought about it. But yes, I suppose you're right. They're certainly not resident here." Elizabeth laughed, a warm sound. "I can hardly imagine Jamaica Inn boasting its own orchestra." John smiled as well. "No, I think not." He stood up. "Come, we've tarried long enough. Rose will be waking up." "You love that child more than anything, don't you?" "Yes." He was suddenly serious. "Could you love her as well?" Elizabeth gave him an enigmatic smile. "I already do," she answered. The bleakness of Bodmin Moor, in contrast to the warm valleys of Devon, brought an involuntary shiver to the apothecary. He sat, one arm round Rose, who by now was fully awake, gazing out of the window, wondering about the beast that Elizabeth had described, and whether it was reality or a creature of legend. In this gaunt countryside, where there was little or no sign of the coming of spring, it was possible to imagine anything. Bad weather lay ahead, for the sky was growing dark, and sporadic drops of rain had started to fall. John and Elizabeth exchanged a glance. "Why don't we stop somewhere and make the rest of the journey in daylight?" he asked. Elizabeth nodded. "A good idea. As soon as we're off this accursed moor, we can make for St. Austell and spend the night there. Shall I tell Jed?" "No, I'll do it." And once again Elizabeth put her head out of the window and shouted instructions. Back came Jed's call. "I'm glad you said that, ma'am. This moor's terrible hard going." And John thought, as they bounced their way across cart tracks, that he had never known anything so uncomfortable, and wondered at the bodily endurance of Rose, although, until now, she was clearly finding the whole thing a great adventure, and had hardly noticed the rigours of the journey. As the day darkened even further, their ordeal finally came to an end. Leaving Bodmin behind them, they picked up the old coaching road and journeyed to St. Austell in relative comfort. Once there, they made their way to the White Hart, a goodly-sized inn, and booked 3 rooms for the night. An hour later, they dined in the parlour reserved for travellers of quality, Rose yawning and tired-eyed throughout. At the end of the meal, John excused himself temporarily and carried the child upstairs, where she went straight away to bed. As he left the room, however, she spoke in a sleepy voice.
Papa?
He turned. Yes, sweetheart?
Are you staying close by?
I have the room next door. Now go to sleep, like a good child.
Will you come and see me later?
You know I will.
Good night, then.
Good night. He went downstairs and found Elizabeth where he had left her, staring into the fire, a glass of wine untouched before her on the table. "Tell me your thoughts," he said, smiling at her. She looked up.
"I was thinking about my son,"
she answered. John did not know what to say, so remained silent.
"Rose reminded me of him. He was so sweet when he was young. Such a lovely child. I loved him with all my heart, you know."
John merely nodded, not interrupting her flow.
"Dear Frederico, how they ruined my beautiful boy."
The apothecary thought then about the society of angels who had once prowled the streets of Exeter and who had welcomed the Marquess's son into their ranks and introduced him to the delights of opium smoking.
"He was so changed in the end,"
Elizabeth said, and for the first time John heard a catch in her voice,
"that even I hardly recognized him."
"You must put it behind you, Elizabeth. We all of us have tragedies to contend with. You really must let the memory go." She looked up at him and gave a bitter little smile.
"Yes, my friend, you have had your share of grief, as I well know. Tell me, how are you coping? Really?"
"I carry on for the sake of my daughter. No, that isn't quite true. I carry on for my own sake as well, because I still want to taste life, to know its peaks and troughs. And there's another thing as well."
"Which is?"
"I carry on to see how we are going to end, Marchesa." She covered his hand with her own.
"What do you mean?"
"You know perfectly well. Every day I'm drawn a little closer to you."
"Do I? Do I know that?"
"Well, if you don't, you should by now. Emilia has been dead for well over a year, and—" He broke off, not quite certain how much more he should say.
"You miss her both mentally and physically?"
"I find it lonely, yes." Elizabeth leant towards him.
"I long to kiss you,"
she said with a smile, repeating something she had said to him a long while ago. "And I you," he answered, and bending his head, took her in his arms. Chapter 3. At long last, she was ready for him, though why the capricious woman's mood had finally changed, John was far from sure. But he did not question it, gladly accepting her eagerness to consummate their long association. Going up the stairs, she leant against him, and opening her bedroom door, led him inside. Once within, with the door securely locked, they kissed long and deep. And in this kiss was all the apothecary's pent-up loneliness and longing, together with his desire for Elizabeth, which had been there from the moment he first saw her. An unhappy memory came then, of the depths of his feelings for Emilia. Involuntarily, John sighed. Elizabeth must have heard it, for she put her hands on either side of his face.
"Don't be sad."
"I'm not. In fact, I'm extremely happy." For answer, she lay down on the bed, and reaching up, pulled John down beside her. For a minute they remained like that, looking intently into each other's face. Then the waters of the dam broke, as love finally came to them both, and together they entered a world of magic. End of Side 1. Side 2. John woke in the middle of the night, thinking he had had the most wonderful dream. Then, reaching out, he felt Elizabeth, sleeping deeply, but still warm and soft from loving. Lighting a candle, which lay beside the bed, he took in every detail of her. The black hair was spread out like a dark veil, curling and tumbling round her head. Her cheek was swept by long, thick lashes.
The scar, which made her at once both ugly and arrestingly beautiful, was softened by the light. Silently, John wept. He wept for Emilia and the fact that his heart had moved on. He wept for Elizabeth, that she had had such a hard and difficult life. Eventually, though, when he had stared at her for what seemed like an age, he blew out the candle and, holding her close to him, slept better than he had for months. He awoke early next morning and crept along the corridor to his own room, where he got into bed. But he couldn't sleep, his mind a strange mixture of peace and guilt. He knew that he had loved Emilia truly, yet now he felt completely absorbed by Elizabeth, and this gave rise to terrible feelings of regret. Yet, at the same time, he knew that he had fallen deeply in love with the Marchesa, and that nothing could stop that passion from growing. And then, suddenly, he remembered something that he had once heard, that love was like a river that flowed into tributaries, and he knew that that was what was taking place within him. Though he would never stop loving Emilia, his flood of feeling had moved inexorably on. He was just closing his eyes to sleep again, when there was a tiny knock low down on his door. "Come in, sweetheart," he called, expecting Rose, and was astonished to see a very small chambermaid bearing a jug of hot water. The apothecary wondered whether to beg her pardon, but decided to ignore it. Instead, he asked, "Have you seen my daughter? She has the room next door." "Oh, yes, sir. She's up and washing herself." John smiled. "I'll go and help her." The girl bobbed a curtsy. "If you please, sir, I can do that. It would be more suitable." "She has no mother," John said by way of explanation. "My wife died some while ago." The maid looked stricken. "Oh, I'm so sorry, sir. I'll go to the little girl immediately." The apothecary, who had been trying to clarify why it was he and not a woman who looked after his daughter, bowed to the inevitable, said thank you, and ruefully shook his head as the maid left the room. Half an hour later, he and Rose sat at breakfast, awaiting the arrival of Elizabeth. His daughter, the apothecary was amused to see, had inherited his liking for a large repast in the mornings, and was currently tucking into a sliver of ham. John was ravenously hungry, and was just ordering more bread when the Marchesa swept up to the table. This morning, in his eyes at least, she looked radiant, and his heart gave a disconcerting lurch at the sight of her. He could not resist asking how she had slept. "Very well, thank you," she answered, and ordered tea and toast. She turned to Rose. "Are you looking forward to seeing the furry?" The child nodded, her mouth being too full to speak. When she had swallowed, she said, "Tell me about it, Mrs. Elizabeth." "Well, it's very old, probably the survival of a pagan ritual dance to do with the rite of spring. It's always danced on the 8th of May, except when that date falls on a Sunday or Monday, when they change the day." "Go on," said Rose. "Couples dress up and dance in and out of people's houses, and the whole town is decorated with flowers and greenery. Then, as well as the furry or floral dance, as it is also known, they do another strange ceremony called the hal and toe." Rose looked enthusiastic. "To start off with, the youths taking part go into the neighbouring woods and gather branches of sycamore. Then they perambulate the town, waving the branches over their heads and singing the hal and toe song at various places of vantage. I don't know the words, but apparently they're the survivors of a medieval sea shanty." "I told you it was heel and toe," interrupted John. "You're probably right." Elizabeth gave him a look in which lay a certain fondness. He returned the glance equally, then turned to his daughter. "So, now you know some more." "It sounds very interesting," she said in her advanced way, and returned to her breakfast. An hour later, they left the White Hart behind them and took the coaching road to Falmouth. From there, Jed turned inland, and they picked their way over rough lanes and cart tracks to Helstone. Looking through the window, John studied the place with interest. There was one large main street with several houses and a building standing out into the thoroughfare. The other streets that he could glimpse were narrow and winding. The whole village was surrounded by pleasant hills and trees, and there was a fine church standing out to the right, while a river ran at the bottom of the town. He thought it rather enchanting and quaint. "It's a magic place," said Rose suddenly. John shivered. He had no idea why. "What makes you say that, sweetheart?" "Because it is," she answered, and refused to elaborate further. They went downhill into the town, through the small streets, then turned left and found themselves in the broad thoroughfare. Elizabeth looked to her left. "There's an inn," she said, "and it's called the Angel." "That's where we'll stay, then." And John put his head out of the window and called up to Jed, who pulled the coach to a halt before the main front door. Rufus jumped down and pulled down the step for John to dismount. Having handed Elizabeth out, the apothecary turned back to lift down Rose. She came willingly enough, but he felt as he picked her up that she was trembling. "What's the matter, darling?" "I don't know, Papa. I feel a bit frightened." "Of what?" Once again she answered, "I don't know." But he could pay her no more attention, for the landlord was coming forward to greet them. "Good day, sir and madam. How may I help you?" "We would like some rooms," Elizabeth answered promptly. "We have come down for Flora Day." "Very good, you'll find it too, ma'am. Would that be 2 rooms you require?" John was hoping she would say yes, but she said, "No, 3. This is my companion, Mr. Rawlings. The little girl is his daughter, Rose. We also require a room for the servants, so 4 in total." Jed and Rufus appeared, bearing the luggage between them. "As you say, ma'am. Now, if you'd like to follow me—" The landlord led the way up a staircase and turned left. "How will this be, ma'am?" He threw open the door to reveal a pleasant room that overlooked the street. "It will suit me perfectly," Elizabeth answered, smiling at the man, who was, John thought, quite handsome in a dark, saturnine way. "And I thought this for the young lady." He showed them a much smaller, darker room next door. "Rose, where is Papa going to sleep?" "I have a room vacant on the next floor, if that is agreeable, sir." John was about to open his mouth to refuse when Rose spoke up. "I'd like to be up there. Then I'll be close to you, Papa." The apothecary bowed to the inevitable. "Very well. Do you have 2 rooms above, landlord?" "I do, sir." "Then kindly show us." Elizabeth spoke. "I shall refresh myself after the journey. I will see you downstairs in half an hour, John." And with that she disappeared into her chamber. The apothecary was left with no alternative but to climb another flight. 30 minutes later, everything had been sorted out, and John descended the staircase, his daughter holding his hand. He found Elizabeth in the parlour, talking to a very unusual-looking woman. Small and extremely thin, she wore a big pair of spectacles which magnified her eyes to an enormous size, giving the impression that she had no other features in her face. She jumped as John entered, shooting him a nervous glance. "Ah, my dear," said the Marchesa, giving him a rapid kiss on the cheek. "Are you all settled?" "Yes, perfectly, thank you." "Mrs. Legassick, may I present my travelling companion, John Rawlings, and this is his daughter, Rose." Mrs. Legassick twittered nervously. "Oh, yes, how do you do? How do you do, indeed?" She gave a sudden smile, bearing rather small, sharp teeth. Rose, meanwhile, made a polite bob. "Oh, what a sweet child! How delightful!" She patted Rose's red curls with enthusiasm, her victim pulling something of a face. "I, alas, have not had any little ones. Are we going to be friends, my dear?" Rose remained silent, staring at the floor, and it was John who spoke up. "She suffers with shyness from time to time. Please forgive her." Nothing could have been further from the truth, but he felt obliged to make some kind of excuse for his daughter's unusual quietness. "Perfectly all right," gushed Mrs. Legassick. "Such a dear little soul. Not like the other little girl who's staying here. But hush, I mustn't speak out of turn." Elizabeth asked, "Have several people arrived to see the floral dance?" "One or two. I am here with my companion, Mrs. Bligh. We both originally came from Cornwall, so we have returned to see the dance. No, the child I spoke of is little Isabel, here with her mother, a Mrs. Pill." "Isabel Pill," said John under his breath, and catching Rose's eye, his mobile brows rose in amusement. "They are accompanied by a Mr. Painter, would you believe?" Mrs. Legassick giggled nervously. "Good gracious," said Elizabeth. "I can hardly wait to meet them. Who else do we have here?" "A lady travelling alone. I believe she might well be an actress or something of that nature. She's a Miss Warwick. That about makes up the number, I think." "Most interesting," said John. He turned to Elizabeth. "Shall we stroll before we dine?" "By all means." She took his arm, and they stepped forth, the child holding his hand on the other side. They found themselves in an unusually wide street, down the side of which flowed a tumbling brook. To ensure that people could step over it, leats had been built which did not hide the rapid torrent that passed beneath. Rose stopped, fascinated. "Oh, look, Father, it's a stream." "I think it's a river, Rose, but I don't know which. Do you, Elizabeth?" "No, but we'll find out. What an amazing thing, isn't it?" But the apothecary's next remarks were suddenly stilled by the sight of the three people coming towards them, who could only, if their descriptions were anything to go by, be Painter and Pill, accompanied by little Isabel. It was to the man that his eyes were drawn, as were those of Elizabeth, he noticed. Tall, just under 6 feet in height, with black hair tied back in a bow, he was devastatingly handsome, and well aware of it. The woman, by contrast, was plain as a poppy seed, and had made no attempt at all to enhance her looks by the use of powder and paint. Shorter than her companion, she was slim, but that was about all that could be said in her favour. She wore a small pair of spectacles perched on an unexceptional nose, while the mouth beneath was thin and closed like a trap. Her eyes were so nondescript as to be almost colourless, and she gazed at the world unsmilingly. Her child, on the other hand, was quite pretty, but spoilt by the most ferocious scowl. Aged about 7, or so John reckoned, she peered out belligerently at the passers-by from a rather attractive pair of eyes beneath a mop of dark hair. The apothecary stole another glance at Painter to see if he was the father, but felt fairly certain that the man was not responsible. Isabel, aware that she was being observed, grasped Painter's hand and hid her face in his breeches, an indelicate move, to say the least. Rose simply gaped, open-mouthed, at the performance. "Mr. Painter, Mr. Painter," came the muffled voice. "Stop them staring at me." Painter made a bow as best he could, with the child burrowing into him, and flashed his green eyes in Elizabeth's direction. "Forgive me, ma'am. Fact is, the child's highly strung. Do apologize." He had a simply stunning voice, well modulated and pleasant to listen to. He was obviously a product of a first-class education, John considered. Elizabeth laughed. "Makes her sound like a fiddle." At this, Mrs. Pill entered the conversation. "There's no need to be personal, ma'am. I had no intention of so being. I apologize if my remark caused offence." "Not at all," said Painter, eyeing the Marchesa up. "Apology accepted. Catherine meant no harm, did you, dear? Where are you staying?" "At the Angel. We've just arrived." "Splendid. So are we. Staying there, I mean. Allow me to present myself. I'm Timothy Painter." "How do you do? My name is John Rawlings." The men bowed. Then Tim went on. And this is my fiancée, Mrs. Pill, and her daughter, Isabel." Catherine Pill bobbed a somewhat grumpy curtsy. Elizabeth spoke up. "I am Elizabeth de Lorenzi. I am delighted to make your acquaintance." Tim looked at her with a sparkle in his eye. "You are Italian, madam?" "No, I am English, sir. My late husband was a Venetian." "I see," he said, and put a wealth of meaning into the two words. Mrs. Pill, clearly noticing that her companion was more than a little distracted by the exquisite Elizabeth, said, "We must continue our promenade, I fear. Good day to you both. No doubt we shall meet again." "We certainly will," said Tim Painter pointedly. John gave him an amused look. "It has been most interesting, sir. Until next time." And with that, he and his party made their way up the street. Rose turned to look at him. "I didn't like that girl, Papa." "Why, darling? She didn't do anything to you." "Nonsense," said the Marchesa briskly. "She was a horrible child, and there's an end to it. All that hiding her face and burying herself in the young man's leg. She's far too old for such a caper." John burst out laughing. "I see that I'm hopelessly outnumbered, and I concede victory immediately. From now on, little Isabel shall be held up as an example of what not to be." Rose suddenly took Elizabeth's hand. "I'm glad we came here. It's going to be unusual." "Why do you say that?" the Marchesa asked curiously. "Because I believe it is," Rose answered, and releasing her fingers, went skipping up the street. Chapter 4. That evening, quite late, while John Rawlings embraced Elizabeth de Lorenzi before making his way back to his own room, a sound of music came from the streets below. Raising his head, John listened. Then he looked at the Marchesa, who lay propped up against the pillow. "Does that seem familiar? Or am I imagining it? But there's an extra instrument. Or two, even." And she was up off the bed and had gone to the window, throwing open the casement in order to peer out. John followed, rather more lazily, and stood beside her. Below them, gathered outside the Angel, were the band of musicians they had encountered in Jamaica Inn, and sure enough, they had acquired a mandora and a fagotto player, a somewhat unusual instrument, on their journey to Helstone. Leading them was the blind fiddler, who stood in their midst, foot tapping, body swaying, giving his all. A group of people had already gathered round them and were clapping to the persistent beat. John turned to Elizabeth. "Shall we join them? Rose is asleep, so we can step outside for a while." But Elizabeth was already pulling on her male garb, not bothering to squeeze into her stays. John, turning from the window, admiringly watched her dress. Her figure was the same as when he had first seen it, long and lean, almost masculine, had it not been for the swell of her beautiful breasts. "You're lovely," he said sincerely. "You think so?" she answered with a half-smile. "You know I do." "Thank you." And she turned away to complete her toilette. 5 minutes later they were ready, and went down into the street to join the small crowd gathered round the musicians. There were now 6 instrumentalists in all: the blind fiddler himself, the man with a pair of kettle-drums strapped round his waist, the flautist, a wee pixie of a person, together with the tambourine, the mandora, and the fagotto players. They'd also acquired along the way a monkey with a tragic face. Dressed in a jacket and a small hat, both of which had seen better days, the wretched creature had attached itself to the tambourinist. He was a spry young fellow with curly brown hair and eyes almost the same colour. But for all that, he was painfully thin, and looked as if he could do with a good meal, or 3. The mandora player, on the other hand, although also thin, had the look of an aesthete, being long of hair and nose, and with a cultivated manner which added to the languid way he plucked the instrument's strings. The fagotto blower, on the other hand, was fat and friendly, puffing his cheeks out as he played, and generally looking round him with an amusing twinkle in his eye, making the crowd laugh, while the man with the kettle-drums appeared a regular rogue, having a craggy face and periwinkle eyes, which he fastened on the Marchesa with a very naughty gaze. "What a motley crew!" she said, laughing. "But they make a good sound," John answered. He bowed to her. "Shall we dance?" "Why not?" And the couple whirled off, only to be joined by others, so that in the end everyone, with the exception of one or two elderly people, was prancing away to the music. Eventually, though, it came to an end, and the blind fiddler, assisted by the young tambourine-player, sent the monkey round with a hat. As the creature approached, its two keepers not far behind, the apothecary spoke. "Well done. Your music is most enjoyable." The monkey rattled the hat, which had a few coins in the bottom. "Now, I'd better pay you, young fellow." John put out a tentative finger towards the creature, but it backed away nervously. "Where did you get him?" he inquired of the tambourine man who had joined the group. The young chap bowed low. "Hello, sir. I'm Gideon. I remember playing for you in Jamaica Inn. We actually bought him at a market. He'd been with a band before, apparently, but for some reason was put up for sale. I think his previous owner died. He seems very nervous. Do you think he was badly treated?" "More than likely. We picked him up for very little money." Elizabeth said, in her straightforward way, "Well, I expect he'll be well fed with you, and loved as best you can." The young man answered simply, "It's hard to love a monkey, but I must admit to having certain feelings of fondness for it." "Then that's as well." The Marchesa put a shilling in the hat, as did John. The sad monkey's face contorted into something resembling a grin before it scampered away to its next customers. The fiddler shuffled up to them. "Thank ye, sir. I'll play again." He picked up his bow once more, and the apothecary, a close quarters now, studied the man. He was unkempt, that much was certain. A great tangle of black hair, streaked here and there with grey, was visible beneath the battered hat he always wore, which was an amazing creation, sporting a selection of dilapidated feathers at one side. It reminded the apothecary of drawings of Robin Hood he had seen from time to time, and he could not help wondering whether the fiddler ever removed it. Beneath this fantastic head of hair were a pair of black spectacles, worn, no doubt, to hide his sightless eyes from the world, which sat atop a hawkish nose. His face, stained a deep brown by constant exposure to the elements, was pitted with the scars of smallpox, and indeed one could have declared him to be a regular vagabond, had it not been for his mouth. For this was passionate and well-formed, the mouth of a sensualist. It was, the apothecary concluded, the one thing that betrayed him to be a musician, speaking as it did of finer feelings. Apart from this unusual quality, the fiddler was thin, reasonably tall, and despite his lack of flesh, strong and wiry. Yet again his hands were exquisite, small and beautifully shaped, as well as being nimble, one running over the strings like a bird in flight, the other guiding the bow to produce beautiful sounds. John, watching him, felt drawn to the man, despite his strange appearance. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was stamping her feet and clapping, when a strange young man bowed before her and led her off to dance. John could only smile half-heartedly as he watched them whirl down the street. It was then that he felt a tug at his hand, and looking down, saw Rose. "What are you doing up?" he asked, somewhat crossly. "Isabel woke me," she answered, her great eyes awash with tears. John crouched down. "What do you mean?" "She came into my room and stood staring at me. Don't be cross, Papa." He was filled with tenderness. "I'm not, sweetheart. I just want to know what happened." "I told you. Isabel entered my room and stared at me." "Did you speak to her?" "No. But, oh, Papa, it was the expression on her face. It was as if she wanted to kill me." Well, stay up for a bit, then I'll go back and sit with you, and tomorrow morning I'll speak to her mother. What will you say? I shall tell her what occurred, and ask for an explanation. Don't worry, darling. It won't happen again, I promise you. Elizabeth, breathless and laughing, was brought back by the young man, who was in very much the same condition. Seeing Rose's unhappy face, she stopped short, but at a silent signal from John, said nothing. His daughter, meanwhile, having cried a little, was being cheered by the atmosphere in the crowd. "It's exciting, Papa." "Isn't it? Now listen carefully. The blind fiddler is just about to start again, and see, he's got a tame monkey with him." They stood enthralled, while the tatterdemalion band struck up once more and played their music to the ever-growing group of people. Rose, John noticed, could not take her eyes from the small simian, which walked round and round with the hat, collecting quite a goodly sum in the process. Eventually, though, they played their final chord, took a bow, and wandered off in the direction of the blue anchor. Elizabeth smiled at Rose. "Are you tired?" "Yes, but Papa said he would sit with me while I go to sleep." "Well then, so he shall." They went back into the Angel, and John carried the half-asleep child upstairs and put her to bed. "Rose, do you want me to lock you in?" "No, I wouldn't like that. Just sit beside me." But something made him stay, even when Rose's breathing deepened, until he too dozed off in the chair beside the bed. How long he remained like that he couldn't say, but he awoke suddenly to find that all was dark, the candle which had been burning having guttered out while he slept. John froze in the darkness, aware of a sound over by the door. There could be no doubt of it. Someone was entering the room. He stood up silently, crossing the small space as quietly as he could, but a floorboard creaked beneath his weight. Realizing that the other person would now be aware of his presence, he sprinted to the door and threw it open. There was nobody there, but hurling himself up the corridor, he spied a small figure clad in a nightgown. It would appear that Isabel had decided to torment his daughter once more. The next morning, at breakfast, John once again signalled to Elizabeth not to ask any questions, though he could see that she was longing to know exactly what was happening. He did say, however, that he was anxious to talk to Mrs. Pill and her daughter. "I don't believe they are down yet. The only people I've seen so far are the two ladies, Mrs. Legassick and Mrs. Bligh. They went out early to perambulate. Wait a minute. I can hear someone coming now." They turned their heads to the door, but the vision that entered was nobody that either the apothecary or the Marchesa had seen before. However, this did not stop either of them staring round-eyed, for the woman was indeed a sight to behold. Dressed to the inch in the very latest fashion, her head covered by a superb hat, her jewels glittering in the morning light, she waved at them nonchalantly before drifting across the dining parlour to take a seat. John, frankly, could not take his eyes off her. He guessed her to be in her 40s, but she had that timeless quality of all great beauties. The setting of her face was stunning, or had once been so, though the apothecary could see a certain hardness about her visage, which made him wonder exactly what her antecedents were. Her hair, though vividly blonde, was beautifully arranged beneath her hat, and the rest of her features were perfect, everything from her great luminous eyes to her sweet little mouth, which was superbly placed. Feeling John's gaze, she turned politely. "Good morning to you, sir. A nice day, is it not?" He was thoroughly nonplussed. Rising from his chair, he made his very best bow. "Indeed it is, madam. May I present myself? My name is John Rawlings." He bowed again. She returned the salute graciously, bowing from the waist. "And I am Diana Warwick. How do you do?" Her gaze swept down and took in Elizabeth. "And this is Mrs. Rawlings?" "No, madam. I am Elizabeth di Lorenzi, widow of the Marchese di Lorenzi of Venice." "I am honoured to make your acquaintance, ma'am." "As I am yours." "This is my daughter, Rose Rawlings," John added, somewhat lamely, frankly daunted by the combined power of these two extraordinary women. Diana Warwick's glance took in Rose, as if she were preparing to sketch her. Eventually she said, "You have very beautiful hair, child." John's daughter smiled dutifully. "Thank you, ma'am." It was at this juncture that Mrs. Pill and Isabel entered the room, Tim, a lazy grin on his face, bringing up the rear. He cast his eyes round, saw Elizabeth, and gave a magnificent bow. The apothecary fixed Isabel with a meaningful glance, to which she responded by pulling a face. Furious, he was about to go over and have it out there and then, but Elizabeth laid a restraining hand on his arm. But more was happening. Diana Warwick had noticed the handsome man bowing to Elizabeth, and was making little movements at her table in order to attract attention, which after a few moments she succeeded in doing. Tim Painter, on the point of sitting down, saw the dazzling woman in the corner, and was frankly making a banquet of her with his eyes. Catherine Pill's momentary look of annoyance was rapidly overtaken by a somewhat phony smile. She gave a small curtsy in Miss Warwick's direction, then sat down and took to ordering her breakfast in a business-like manner. Tim, after bowing fulsomely once more, also took his seat. "It would appear that the lady has made an impression," murmured John. Elizabeth gave a cat-like smile. "Mrs. Pill covers her anger well," she whispered back. The apothecary dropped his voice even lower. "How old do you think Miss Warwick is?" The Marchesa ran her eye over the woman, who was by now glancing at a newspaper as she sipped her tea. "Same as me, in her late 40s. John stared at her. "I never think of you as that age. To me, you will always be young and alluring." Elizabeth laughed aloud. "Maybe, but how does the rest of the world see me? That is the question." "Well, if our Mr. Painter is anything to go by, I would imagine very much as I do." She did not reply, but instead stretched out her hand and laid it on John's arm. For a moment there was silence. Then Rose spoke. "That horrible Isabel is looking at me." "Well, stare at her, do. You've nothing to be afraid of, Rose. She can't hurt you." His daughter looked up at him. "I'm not so sure of that, Papa." Breakfast over, John went to tackle Mrs. Pill. Crossing to her table, he gave a formal bow and said, "I wonder if I might have a word, madam." Catherine regarded him icily. "Pray do." "I would rather it was in private." Tim Painter looked up, the expression in his eyes one of amused laziness. "I'll leave you, then. I feel you should be present, sir. But I really meant, could we speak somewhere else, not in so public a place?" Isabel spoke in a whining tone. "What does he want, Mamma?" Mrs. Pill looked at her lovingly. "Nothing, my sweetheart. But I think it best if you go for a walk with Mr. Painter." "I don't want to." "Neither do I," added Tim. Mrs. Pill pursed her plain lips together, but instantly gave in. "Then in that case, you must both remain. Shall we step into the other parlour?" "Certainly," said John. End of Side 2.